Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a really intense and important topic, the rise of Nazism. This is part one of a four-part series where we'll explore the origins, ideologies, and consequences of Nazism and how it shaped the world as we know it today. So buckle up, because this is going to be a deep and thought-provoking journey. Let's start by setting the stage. Nazism, also known as National Socialism, was a totalitarian movement led by Adolf Hitler in Germany. It emerged in the early 20th century and became one of the most destructive forces in modern history. But how did it all begin? Well, to understand that, we need to go back to the roots of Nazism and the conditions that allowed it to flourish. Nazism didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had deep roots in German history and culture. One of the key influences was the Prussian tradition, which emphasized militarism and discipline. Think of leaders like Frederick the Great and Otto von Bismarck, who shaped Prussia into a powerful, militaristic state. This tradition glorified the army and saw it as a model for society. But that's not all. Nazism also drew from political romanticism, which rejected rationalism and the ideas of the French Revolution. Instead, it focused on instinct, tradition, and the idea of a superior individual who was above the law. Sounds familiar, right? Now, let's talk about some of the intellectual figures who influenced early Nazism. People like Richard Wagner, the famous composer, and Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born writer, promoted the idea of racial and cultural superiority. They believed that the so-called Nordic or Germanic peoples were superior to other races. These ideas laid the groundwork for the racial theories that would later become central to Nazi ideology. But Nazism wasn't just about ideas. It was also shaped by the personal experiences of its leader, Adolf Hitler. Hitler's early life was marked by struggle and failure. He was an aspiring artist who faced constant rejection and lived in poverty in Vienna. During this time, he was exposed to pan-Germanic expansionist ideas and anti-Semitism, which were prevalent in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These experiences fueled his intense nationalism, his hatred of Jews, and his contempt for Slavs. It's important to note that Hitler's personal beliefs were heavily influenced by the environment he grew up in, and these beliefs would later become the foundation of Nazi ideology. However, the rise of Nazism in Germany wouldn't have been possible without the aftermath of World War I. Germany's defeat in 1918 was a massive blow to the nation's pride. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war, imposed harsh penalties on Germany, including massive reparations and territorial losses. Many Germans felt betrayed by their leaders, who they believed had stabbed them in the back by agreeing to the treaty. This sense of betrayal and humiliation created a fertile ground for Hitler's message of revenge and national revival. Hitler's propaganda was incredibly effective. He promised to restore Germany's greatness, rearm the military, and overturn the Treaty of Versailles. His message resonated with many Germans, especially those in the lower middle class who had been hit hard by the economic turmoil of the 1920s. The hyperinflation of 1923 wiped out the savings of many families, leading to widespread anger and disillusionment. Hitler's call for a strong, unified Germany under his leadership appealed to those who felt abandoned by the existing political system. But Hitler didn't just rely on economic grievances to gain support. He also exploited the fear of communism. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, many Germans were terrified that a similar communist uprising could happen in Germany. Hitler positioned himself and the Nazi Party as the bulwark against communism, which helped him gain the support of conservative elements in society. However, many of these conservatives didn't fully understand the totalitarian nature of Hitler's movement. They thought they could control him, but they were wrong. One of Hitler's most significant contributions to the rise of Nazism was his understanding of mass psychology and propaganda. He believed that propaganda should be simple, emotional, and repetitive. It didn't need to be truthful. It just needed to be effective. Hitler's ability to manipulate public opinion through propaganda was a key factor in the Nazi Party's rise to power. He knew how to tap into people's fears, hopes, and prejudices, and he used that knowledge to build a mass movement. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party had become a major political force in Germany. In 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor, and within a short time, he consolidated power and established a totalitarian regime. The Nazis quickly moved to suppress opposition, control the media, and eliminate any threats to their rule. In this video, we're going to explore some of the more controversial and complex aspects of Nazi ideology, specifically the religious dimensions of Nazism and Adolf Hitler's personal views on religion. We'll also take a closer look at the economic policies the Nazis implemented once they came to power. So, let's get into it. First up, let's talk about the religious aspect of Nazism. This is a topic that has sparked a lot of debate among historians and scholars. On the surface, Nazism might seem like a purely political and racial ideology, but there's actually a lot more to it when it comes to religion. Some have even argued that Nazism had quasi-religious elements, with Hitler being seen as a kind of messianic figure by his followers. But what exactly were Hitler's religious beliefs, and how did they influence Nazi ideology? Adolf Hitler's religious views are a bit of a mystery. He was born into a Catholic family and was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. However, from a young age, he expressed skepticism and even hostility toward Christianity. According to some accounts, Hitler's confirmation in the Catholic Church was a reluctant affair, with witnesses saying he had to be dragged through the ceremony. After leaving home at 18, Hitler reportedly never attended Mass or participated in any religious sacraments again. So it's clear that Hitler wasn't a devout Catholic. But what did he actually believe? Well, historians generally agree that Hitler was irreligious and anti-Christian. In private, he often criticized Christianity, calling it a harmful superstition and blaming it for weakening the Aryan race. He saw Christianity as a tool of the Jews, designed to undermine the strength and purity of the Germanic people. However, in public, Hitler and the Nazi Party promoted something called positive Christianity, which was a watered-down version of Christianity that rejected traditional doctrines like the divinity of Jesus and the Old Testament. Instead, they portrayed Jesus as an Aryan fighter who opposed Jewish materialism. This was clearly a strategic move to appeal to the majority of Germans who identified as Christian. But here's the thing: Hitler's public embrace of Christianity was largely a facade. In private, he made it clear that he had no real belief in Christian teachings. According to Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, Hitler was a fierce opponent of the Vatican and Christianity, but he refrained from openly attacking the church for tactical reasons. Hitler knew that he needed the support of the German people, many of whom were devout Christians, so he played along with the religious narrative while secretly planning to reduce the influence of Christianity in Germany. Once the Nazis were in power, they began to systematically undermine the church. They sought to coordinate German Protestants under a unified Reich Church, but this effort was resisted by the Confessing Church, a group of Protestant clergy who opposed Nazi interference in religious matters. The Catholic Church also faced persecution, despite the Reich Concordat, an agreement between Nazi Germany and the Vatican that was supposed to protect the rights of Catholics. In reality, the Nazis routinely violated the Concordat, arresting priests, closing Catholic schools, and suppressing Catholic organizations. Smaller religious groups, like Jehovah's Witnesses, faced even harsher treatment. They were persecuted for refusing to swear allegiance to Hitler or serve in the military. And of course, the Jews were the primary target of Nazi persecution, culminating in the Holocaust. Hitler's ultimate goal was to eliminate Christianity in Germany, or at least to subjugate it to Nazi ideology. He believed that science and Nazism would eventually replace religion, and he saw the church as an obstacle to his vision of a totalitarian state. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the economic policies of the Nazi regime. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany was in the midst of the Great Depression. Unemployment was sky high, and the economy was in shambles. Hitler knew that if he wanted to maintain power, he needed to fix the economy, and fast. So, what did the Nazis do? One of the first things the Nazis did was to implement a series of economic reforms aimed at reducing unemployment and stimulating growth. They launched massive public works projects, like the construction of the Autobahn, which created jobs for thousands of Germans. They also introduced policies to promote national self-sufficiency, or autarky, which meant reducing Germany's dependence on foreign trade. This included imposing tariffs on imports and encouraging the production of goods within Germany. But here's where things get interesting. The Nazis didn't just focus on civilian industries. They believed that war was the primary engine of human progress, and they saw the economy as a tool to prepare Germany for future conflicts. Almost immediately after coming to power, the Nazis began a massive program of military rearmament. They poured resources into building up the German military, and by the late 1930s, military spending accounted for a huge portion of the German economy. This was funded largely through deficit financing, with the Nazis planning to pay off their debts by plundering the wealth of conquered nations during the war. The Nazis also formed close partnerships with big businesses. In exchange for supporting the regime, companies like Thyssen, Krupp, and Siemens received lucrative contracts and subsidies. At the same time, the Nazis suppressed trade unions and workers' rights, seeing them as a threat to their control. Small businesses, on the other hand, didn't fare as well. Many were forced to close due to stricter regulations, despite the fact that small business owners had been some of the Nazis' earliest supporters. Farmers, however, did benefit under the Nazis. Agricultural prices and wages increased, and the Hereditary Farm Law of 1933 prevented farms from being repossessed, giving farming families greater security. This was part of the Nazis' broader blood and soil ideology, which romanticized rural life and saw farmers as the backbone of the Aryan race. By the late 1930s, the German economy was booming, at least on the surface. Unemployment had dropped significantly, and many Germans saw their standard of living improve. But this economic success came at a cost. The Nazis' focus on rearmament meant that consumer goods were often in short supply, and many Germans faced rationing. Moreover, the economy was built on a foundation of debt and exploitation, with the Nazis relying on slave labor from concentration camps and occupied territories to keep their war machine running. So, to sum up, the Nazis' economic policies were a mix of public works, military spending, and exploitation. They managed to pull Germany out of the Great Depression, but at the cost of turning the economy into a tool for war and oppression. And while some groups, like farmers and big businesses, benefited from Nazi policies, others, like small business owners and workers, saw their freedoms and livelihoods eroded. Neo-Nazism, the revival of Nazi ideology. First, let's talk about neo-Nazism. After World War II, you might think that Nazism was completely discredited and wiped out, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Neo-Nazism refers to post-World War II movements that seek to revive and implement Nazi ideology. These groups are often militant, ultra-nationalist, and deeply racist. They promote hatred against minorities, including Jews, immigrants, LGBTQ+ communities, and other marginalized groups. Sound familiar? That's because neo-Nazis borrow heavily from the original Nazi playbook. Neo-Nazis are a global phenomenon, with organized groups in many countries. They often use Nazi symbols, like the swastika, and admire Adolf Hitler. One of the most disturbing aspects of neo-Nazism is Holocaust denial. Many neo-Nazis claim that the Holocaust never happened or that its scale has been exaggerated. This is not only false, but also deeply offensive to the millions of victims and their families. But neo-Nazism isn't just about racism and anti-Semitism. Some neo-Nazi groups have developed more complex ideologies, including something called the Hyperborean racial doctrine. This is a spiritual and esoteric theory of race that goes beyond the scientific racism of the 20th century. According to this doctrine, the so-called Aryan race has a divine origin and is destined to return to a golden age of purity and power. This theory draws on elements of Gnosticism and Tantrism, and it's often tied to bizarre claims about extraterrestrial origins of the Aryan race. Yes, it's as outlandish as it sounds. Ecology and environmentalism in neo-Nazism. Now, here's where things get really unexpected. Some neo-Nazi groups have embraced environmentalism and ecology as part of their ideology. This might seem contradictory at first. How can a movement rooted in hatred and violence also care about the environment? But for neo-Nazis, environmentalism is tied to their blood and soil ideology, which romanticizes rural life and sees the land as intrinsically connected to the Aryan race. This form of environmentalism is often referred to as eco-fascism. It's a variation of deep ecology that emphasizes the preservation of nature for the benefit of a specific racial group. In other words, neo-Nazis aren't interested in saving the planet for everyone. They want to protect the environment as a way to preserve the purity of the Aryan race. This ideology has its roots in the original Nazi regime, where figures like Richard Walter Duré, the Reich Minister of Food and Agriculture, promoted the idea of a harmonious relationship between the Aryan people and the land. But don't be fooled. This isn't genuine environmentalism. Eco-fascism is deeply exclusionary and often used to justify racist policies. For example, some neo-Nazi groups argue that overpopulation and environmental degradation are caused by non-white immigrants, and they use this as a justification for their xenophobic and anti-immigrant rhetoric. It's a dangerous distortion of environmentalism that has no place in the modern world. The consequences of Nazism. Germany after World War II. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the consequences of Nazism, starting with Germany. The aftermath of World War II was devastating for Germany. The country was in ruins, with its major cities destroyed by Allied bombings. Millions of Germans had died during the war, including nearly 2 million civilians. But the suffering didn't end with the war. In the years that followed, Germany faced denazification, a process led by the Allies to remove Nazi influence from German society. Denazification involved everything from banning the Nazi Party to prosecuting war criminals in the Nuremberg trials. However, as the Cold War intensified, the Allies began to scale back their denazification efforts in West Germany. Many former Nazis were able to reintegrate into society, and some even held positions in the new West German government. This led to a lot of controversy and soul-searching in post-war Germany, as people grappled with the legacy of Nazism and their own complicity in its crimes. One of the most painful consequences of the war was the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe. After the war, the Allies redrew Germany's borders, ceding large portions of territory to Poland and the Soviet Union. As a result, millions of Germans were forced to leave their homes and flee westward. This mass expulsion was often brutal, with estimates of deaths ranging from 500,000 to 3 million. It was a tragic and chaotic period that left deep scars on German society, the impact on world politics and international law. The consequences of Nazism weren't limited to Germany. They had a profound impact on world politics and international law. The horrors of the Holocaust and the atrocities committed by the Nazis led to a global reckoning with issues of human rights and genocide. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Genocide Convention, which made genocide a crime under international law. That same year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was also adopted, laying the foundation for modern human rights law. The Nuremberg trials were another major milestone. For the first time in history, leaders of a defeated nation were held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The trials established the principle that individuals could be held responsible for their actions even if they were following orders. This was a groundbreaking development in international law, and it set a precedent for future war crimes tribunals. Racism and multiculturalism in the post-war world. The Nazi regime's extreme racism also had a lasting impact on global attitudes toward race. After the world saw the horrors of the Holocaust, there was a widespread rejection of racial superiority theories. In many Western countries, liberal anti-racism became a cornerstone of government policy, and openly racist publications were marginalized. This shift paved the way for the rise of multiculturalism in the post-war era, as societies became more tolerant of different cultures and ethnicities. However, the legacy of Nazism also led to a lingering anti-German sentiment in many parts of the world. For decades after the war, Germans were often viewed with suspicion and contempt, particularly in countries that had suffered under Nazi occupation. This created a complex and often painful dynamic for post-war Germans, who had to navigate their identity in the shadow of their country's dark past. The military legacy of Nazism. Finally, let's talk about the military legacy of Nazism. The Nazi regime was known for its innovative and brutal military tactics, including the use of blitzkrieg or lightning war. This strategy involved rapid, coordinated attacks using tanks, aircraft, and infantry to overwhelm the enemy. While the Nazis didn't invent blitzkrieg, they perfected it, and their early successes in World War II were largely due to this tactic. However, as the war dragged on, the Allies began to adopt and adapt Nazi military strategies. The Soviet Union, for example, used similar tactics to turn the tide against Germany on the Eastern Front. The United States also employed massive aerial bombardments, much like the Nazis had done earlier in the war. By the end of the war, the German military was on the defensive, and its technological innovations, like jet aircraft and long-range missiles, came too late to change the outcome. The long-term consequences of Nazism. The legacy of Nazism is one of the most profound and far-reaching in modern history. Its impact can still be felt today, not just in Germany, but around the world. Let's start by looking at how Nazism shaped post-war Germany and its path to recovery. After World War II, Germany was divided into East and West. West Germany, under Allied occupation, underwent a process of denazification, which aimed to remove Nazi influence from society. However, as the Cold War intensified, denazification efforts were scaled back, and many former Nazis were able to reintegrate into society. This led to a lot of internal conflict and debate in Germany about how to deal with the country's Nazi past. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed government took a different approach. They framed themselves as the anti-fascist state, claiming to have completely eradicated Nazism. However, this narrative often ignored the fact that many former Nazis were also absorbed into the East German government and military. The division of Germany and the differing approaches to dealing with the Nazi legacy created a complex and often contradictory historical memory. It wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that West Germany began to confront its Nazi past more openly. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in the 1960s brought Nazi war criminals to justice and sparked a broader public discussion about the Holocaust. This period also saw the rise of a new generation of Germans who were determined to reckon with their country's history and ensure that such atrocities could never happen again. The impact on modern far-right movements. While the Nazi regime was defeated in 1945, its ideology didn't disappear. Instead, it evolved into neo-Nazism and other far-right movements that continue to promote hatred and extremism. These groups often draw on Nazi symbols, rhetoric, and ideology, but they have also adapted to the modern world, using the internet and social media to spread their message. One of the most alarming trends in recent years is the normalization of far-right extremism in mainstream politics. In some countries, far-right parties with ties to neo-Nazi ideologies have gained significant political power. These parties often use coded language to appeal to a broader audience, downplaying their extremist roots while promoting xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and nationalist policies. The rise of far-right extremism has been fueled by a number of factors, including economic inequality, social unrest, and the spread of misinformation online. The internet has become a breeding ground for hate groups, allowing them to connect, organize, and recruit new members across borders. This has made it increasingly difficult for governments and law enforcement agencies to combat extremism, the ongoing struggle against hate and extremism. So, what can be done to combat the resurgence of Nazism and far-right extremism? The first step is education. It's crucial that people understand the history of Nazism and the horrors it unleashed. By learning about the past, we can recognize the warning signs of extremism and take action to prevent it from gaining a foothold in society. Another important tool is legislation. Many countries have laws that prohibit hate speech, Holocaust denial, and the use of Nazi symbols. These laws are essential for curbing the spread of extremist ideologies, but they must be enforced consistently and fairly. At the same time, it's important to strike a balance between protecting free speech and preventing the spread of hate. Civil society also has a critical role to play. Organizations that promote tolerance, diversity, and human rights are on the front lines of the fight against extremism. By fostering dialogue and understanding between different communities, these groups can help to build a more inclusive and resilient society. Finally, we all have a responsibility to speak out against hate and extremism, whether it's calling out racist jokes, challenging stereotypes, or standing up to discrimination. Every action counts. Silence only empowers those who seek to divide us, so it's up to all of us to make our voices heard. The lessons of Nazism. The rise and fall of Nazism offer some important lessons for us today. First and foremost, it's a reminder of the dangers of authoritarianism and the importance of defending democratic institutions. The Nazi regime came to power through a combination of propaganda, fear-mongering, and the erosion of democratic norms. We must be vigilant in protecting our democracies and resisting any attempts to undermine them. Second, Nazism shows us the catastrophic consequences of racism and xenophobia. The Holocaust was the ultimate expression of these ideologies, but they continue to fuel violence and discrimination around the world. We must reject all forms of racism and work towards a more just and equitable society. Finally, Nazism reminds us of the power of propaganda and the importance of critical thinking. Hitler and the Nazis were masters of manipulation, using propaganda to spread lies and incite hatred. In today's world of social media and fake news, it's more important than ever to question the information we receive and seek out reliable sources. Conclusion: never again. The phrase "never again" has become a rallying cry in the fight against hatred and extremism. It's a promise to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. But for this promise to mean anything, it must be backed by action. We must confront the legacy of Nazism head-on, educate future generations, and stand up to hate in all its forms. That's it for our 4-part series on the rise of Nazism. I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of how Nazism came to power, its impact on the world, and the lessons we can learn from this dark chapter in history. If you found this series informative, please give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and remember, the fight against hate and extremism is far from over. Let's keep working together to build a better future. See you next time.